Streaming only on Peacock.
John Wayne Gacy is suspected of having killed as many as 32.
Straight from the killer's mouth.
They want you to believe that I alone committed these murders.
The new gripping 6-part documentary series that investigates the crimes that shocked the nation.
The thing everybody thought they knew wasn't the whole story.
John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise. All episodes streaming now. Only on Peacock.
The unstoppable spirit lives inside all of us. For Matt and Lisa Kuhn, it's fueled by family. Working together to make vehicles more useful for their community, they've become leaders in last-mile transportation. That's why First Horizon is proud to celebrate unstoppable spirits like Matt and Lisa. From the first stop to the final destination, we use our understanding to keep our clients headed toward success. Visit firsthorizon.com/unstoppable to learn how unstoppable starts here.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by cartking.com. That's cart-king.com. And you give me a call at 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps the current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services. Well, CartKing.com can be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail, coffee, and food carts and kiosks that money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. So you go to cart-king.com. You'll look up whatever applies to your business. They'll custom design it for you. They'll ship it to you worldwide. Give them a call, 877-986-7771. Okay. We got a fascinating guest here. He's a local Vegas ex-FBI agent. His name is Scott Decker. You can find his website as rscottdecker.com. The book we're going to be talking about today is his area of expertise, Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. If you're locally here, you can catch him down. He's going to be at the Mob Museum coming up November 23rd at the Mob Museum, 4 p.m. It's a Black Friday, right before, what do you call it, Thanksgiving. But also, too, in Phoenix, Arizona. He's going to be at the Arizona State University November 1st to November 3rd. So, Scott Decker, are you there?
Yes, I am, Ed.
Thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Who is Scott Decker?
I retired from the FBI as a special agent in 2011. Time has really flown by since retirement. I'm sure you hear a lot of people say that. Before the FBI, I went to grad school at University of Michigan and gained a doctorate in human genetics. I then went to private industry. The new biotech companies were starting up back then, and I joined one of those outside Boston. And then I decided to throw my hat in the ring for the FBI, and lo and behold, they picked me up, and I went to the FBI Academy back in '90. And I made it through that. And that's kind of a selection process, really. They teach you things, but they also evaluate us at the same time, put us under a microscope. I survived that and went back to Boston for a few years and worked on bank robberies and armored car robberies. So I transferred to counterterrorism and went down to Quantico. And then on September 12, 2001, I went up to Ground Zero in New York City, and we set up a command post at the what we called the Pile, Ground Zero, for a couple of weeks. Then I came back to Washington, D.C., and around the same time I came back, there were news reports of somebody who had died in Florida of inhalational anthrax, which was unusual because that was the first inhalational anthrax death in the U.S. in the 25 years. And it was also unusual because the person that died was an office worker in humid South Florida. So all that did not add up to a natural outbreak of anthrax. It sounded like bioterrorism to those of us at headquarters, but it had to be proved yet, and that's where my book starts out, that journey.
Did you have an expertise in anthrax?
At the time, I did not. After the bank robbery squad in Boston at Quantico, I first joined the new unit called the Hazardous Materials Response Unit. We were a new unit formed in, I think, 1996 officially. I joined in 97. Our mission was to collect, preserve, and identify, analyze evidence from a weapon of mass destruction crime scene. And that could be biological, it could be chemical, and certainly nuclear or radiological. We trained in all four of those substances, weapons, I guess would be the best word. My background was human genetics, and I had also worked on human viruses after graduate school. And I also worked on infectious disease diagnostics, but I had never grown anthrax. What I had done when I was at the hazmat unit, I did hire the first two microbiologists that the FBI has, Doug Beecher and Doug Anders. They're both excellent, and I believe they're still with the Bureau. Those were our first two trained microbiologists, and they worked as microbiologists for the FBI. Doug Beecher especially was our go-to guy for anthrax questions until I came up to speed, and a few of others of us came up to speed. What it did help me is my work in diagnostic test development helped a great deal because I applied that directly to the anthrax case. But we're jumping ahead a couple of years.
Okay, so you were down at Ground Zero in New York City because of the 9/11 attacks, the airplanes crashed into the buildings. And then when you heard about this Robert Stevens over there in Florida, they pulled you off that and sent you to Florida?
What happened, and this is all described in my book, and I was up at Ground Zero, and we had a command post right at the edge of the pile. We could watch it during the day. When it rained, a couple of days, it was just mud and ash and cement dust. It was bad, and unfortunately, a lot of the people there are now coming down with cancer and dying and whatnot. So I guess we have that to look forward to down the road. But anyway, I was up there for a couple of weeks, and I was hearing bits and pieces of the investigation into 9/11 and so forth, and I just got tired of working support. I wanted to be at the front of an investigation. I wanted to physically go investigate terrorists like those who had done 9/11 acts, hijackings. And in my role as a hazardous material response unit supervisor, I would get into the investigation a little bit in the beginning, and then we would go off and collect evidence for another one, but I never saw the whole investigation through, and I missed that. I'd done that at bank robberies. So I found I went up to 26 Federal Plaza, which was a few blocks from Ground Zero. The FBI had evacuated their offices, but there still was FBI police on duty, and I badged my way in. I found a computer, and I wrote a memo demoting myself to street agent and sent it down to headquarters. So it's called step down.
Okay.
So I stepped down, means I dropped myself a grade so I could go back to investigations. And when they saw that, they brought my butt back to Washington, and I was temporary at headquarters until my new transfer order came through. So I had the 3 to 11 desk up in the command center at headquarters, fielding threats and phone calls for weapons of mass destruction. Then the transfer unit cut my orders, and they sent me to the Washington field office just as the anthrax case was spinning up. And they immediately put me on that.
They sent you because they were mailing these things to D.C. as well, right? So did you ever go down to Florida to investigate that end of things?
No, I never did. People did. Doug Beecher was down there for a while. he got sent down there. We had the outbreak in Florida. We never recovered a letter, but the mailboxes at the building where the man worked were filled with anthrax spores. So it was highly suggestive of the mail. We had two mail letters in New York City, and we had 2 letters on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So the targets were New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boca Raton, Florida. Each office opened up their own investigation, but then headquarters realized everything was connected. We showed that scientifically very quickly. So they rolled and consolidated the investigation into a single office, and they chose the Washington field office for that, and that's where I was. That's how that happened. And Washington field office became what we call in the Bureau Office of Origin. They were the Office of Origin for the investigation. We were responsible for sending leads around the country and developing additional leads and eventually try to solve the case. Eventually to solve the case, I should say.
Now the letters alluded to Allah and stuff like that. So did you immediately think that there was a connection between the anthrax, because everyone else did, there was a connection between the anthrax attacks and the airplane attacks?
Yeah, I would have to say for the first 3 to 4 weeks, we, at least I and others that I worked with, suspected al-Qaeda. I know the country, the administration on Capitol Hill suspected Iraq, and they suspected al-Qaeda was in collusion with Iraq. None of that turned out to be true. We never found one shred of evidence that Iraq was involved. Al-Qaeda, I think, my personal theory is, this is not the Bureau's theory or any other agent, but I tried to bring this out in the book, show not tell, as we say. I think the mailer sent the first letter down to Boca Raton in an effort to get us to look at al-Qaeda and either stir up things and cause war, or to get us away from looking at him. And the reason I say that is there were several coincidences. Robert Stevens, the first death, was a photographer, a photograph editor for American Media. American Media publishes National Enquirer, the Globe, and the Sun, what we refer to as supermarket tabloids. They're very inflammatory sometimes. And back in September of 2001, they had published some very inflammatory photos and stories about Osama bin Laden. Very, very insulting, a couple of them, headlines. And I kind of think that brought the AMI's attention to the mailer. Also, around that time, or I guess a week after 9/11, President and the Attorney General, I'm sorry, let me back up. The Director of FBI, and that was Robert Mueller at the time, he had just come on board, and the Attorney General were holding daily press conferences. And they announced to everybody that about half of the hijackers lived around Boca Raton. I think 9 out of the 18 at least, if not more, lived right around that area. To make it even more suspicious, one of the managing editors at American Media, his wife was a realtor. Their last name is Irish, and there are several other books about the case. This is nothing that's never been made public. Her first name eludes me right now, but it's in the book, several books. Anyway, she had rented an apartment to, I think, 2 or 4 of the hijackers. It was either 2 of them or 4 of them. It was really important. And they were immediately interviewed after 9/11 by agents from Miami because of this. It proved to be a pure coincidence. But there were things like this. And the other thing that kind of made me think it might have been al-Qaeda was the letters we found were postmarked in Trenton, New Jersey. And if you remember the first bombing of the World Trade Center, where they used a van loaded with explosives and parked it underneath, those terrorists had lived in North Jersey.
Right.
I know I'm from New Jersey. I know the area. So that, again, was a little bit suspicious. So all these things came together And then, of course, the letter alluded to Allah's great, and they misspelled penicillin, and they referenced 9/11. So all these things, I think, were purposely, not the New Jersey connection, but the Florida connections, were made for us to start looking at al-Qaeda.
Okay, well, wait a second. So the mailer mails one of the letters to Stevens, or Stevens came to contact with this letter, and Stevens' wife was a real estate agent who rented apartments to the 9/11 hijackers.
No, Robert Stevens and Maureen Stevens were married.
Okay.
Robert Stevens died from inhalational anthrax, and a lot of spores were found around his work area at the AMI building. A managing editor, a senior position to Robert Stevens, was a man with the last name of Irish. He was a manager editor at the same building. His wife was a realtor.
Gotcha.
So it turned out to be all coincidence, really.
There's a connection, but it's like you said, it could be coincidence. Now, would the mailer have? You're saying that the mailer did that to throw you off the track, but how would the mailer know this?
That's my personal theory.
Okay.
Because the tabloids were publishing photographs and inflammatory headlines about Osama bin Laden after 9/11. And those tabloids are nationwide. You can buy them anywhere in the country. And the other thing was the daily press conferences from the director and the AG also described the terrorists and where they lived. And about half of them lived around Boca Raton in Florida before the hijackings. So those two things were widely publicly known. And I think the first letters, if indeed it was the first letter, and I think it was, went to Florida, the company in Boca Raton, I think as an effort. And then the wording in the letter, obviously referred to Allah, Islam. All those three things came together, I think, with purpose to kind of make us look at al-Qaeda first. And we did for 3 or 4 weeks.
What was the span of time between the plane crashes in New York City and when the anthrax started turning up? How many days passed?
Let me pause for a second. Rather than give you bad information, I also have an old computer. It's kind of slow.
Wait a second. You just look at Wikipedia. I got it pulled up here. It's my own question.
I'm going to cheat, too.
Okay.
In order to write the book, and this is how I go about when I write nonfiction, I put together a timeline. And I have an extensive timeline for the case. It helps me with the chapter breaks and whatnot.
Right.
So what was the question? When was the first letter received?
Yeah, the airplane attacks in New York were September 11th, and it looks like the first anthrax attack started September 18th.
That doesn't sound very professional, does it? September 11th, we had the airplane attacks.
Right.
On October 4th was the diagnosis and the public announcement of Stevens having anthrax. So approximately 3 weeks, September 11th to October 4th. When we got the letters in, our postal inspectors that we were working with checked the postmark, and there's other markings in invisible ink that you can read under UV light they used. The letters were mailed between September 17 and September 18 from Princeton, New Jersey. So we had the 9/11 attacks on September 11. First letters were mailed September 17 to 18th, a week later. And then on October 4th, we had the first diagnosis of anthrax.
So now that fascinates me, okay, because it's like a 7-day span from the 2011 to 2018, right?
Yep. And
so this mailer had this anthrax in his pocket or in his desk somewhere, ready to go, and he just threw this together in 7 days. Said, "Hey, I'm gonna handwrite these envelopes." You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's one of the $100 questions of the investigation. We never did get that fully, never answer that. All we can do is speculate. It appears that the mailer had the stuff already made or partially made before September 11. It appears. We have no proof of it. But when you look at the timeline, as you have, and the amount of work it would take to make these dry spores, it would probably be more than 7 days. Probably. I mean, it's just, it could be done, but when you look at the windows of opportunity for the mailer, the window isn't there. He didn't have the time during those 7 days to work alone enough to be able to do this. So it appears that he had the stuff made or partially made before 9/11, and then 9/11 gave him the opportunity to drop the letters in the mail and to try to frame al-Qaeda to do it, that had done it. That's again my speculation.
Now, if we settle on, you believe Bruce Ivins is the mailer?
Yes.
Okay, so if we settle on Ivins as the mailer, what would motivate him to want to direct the FBI's attention to al-Qaeda?
Well, I think, we would get to this at some point in the interview. The motive for the mailing, again, is speculation. We can't interview Bruce at this point. It goes back to the anthrax vaccine. I don't know if you recall, back in, now I'm going to guess on some years here, I could be off by a year, but 1999 or year 2000, and I have the article on my computer. I can pull it down off the hard drive if really necessary. But back at that time, before 2001, September 2001, an article appeared in Vanity Fair by a reporter, journalist from Baltimore. I believe he was from Baltimore. And it blamed the anthrax vaccine, which was mandated that every soldier, airman, and Marine be given the vaccine, was causing Gulf War syndrome. That was from the first Gulf War, around 91, I believe, early 91. These guys were coming back, and they had some undiagnosed symptoms, which were very odd, and it became known as Gulf War syndrome. And this Vanity Fair article blamed the vaccine, said the vaccine was causing Gulf War syndrome, and it became politically a hot potato, I guess, because when the Secretary of Defense mandated that all servicemen be vaccinated and servicewomen be vaccinated with anthrax, some resisted, and I do believe there was a couple court martials occurred because the servicemen and women were refusing to do it. So it was already a political hot potato, maybe. And then this Vanity Fair article made it even worse for the Pentagon to try and control the information and the speculation and so forth. I think at the same time, around the same time, the Pentagon was dealing with the bad press and so forth. I believe they also looked at the likelihood of anthrax being used on the battlefield versus a large radiological bomb, a 1,000-pound bomb, certainly improvised devices, as we saw, were being used quite widely. And they looked at the resources being put into anthrax research and the vaccine versus the likelihood that this stuff may really be used as a widespread weapon. It wasn't adding up. So the command where Bruce Ivins worked pulled him in during the summer of 2001 and told him that they were probably going to shut down anthrax research, and it would be best if he began researching foot and mouth disease as a weapon. And we know from emails that we looked at later on in the case that this made him irate. He did not want to stop working on anthrax. It was his career. He had been doing it for 20-some years, and he just basically wasn't going to fall in line and just quit anthrax research. And we believe he did the mailings in order to preserve anthrax research, get more money for anthrax vaccine, and just more money in general for anthrax. And that's what happened. That was exactly the result. A lot of money, since these anthrax attacks, has been put into biological weapon research. So if that was his motive, he did achieve it. And again, that's speculation. None of us know for sure why he did it.
Did he benefit from any of that extra funding before his came under suspicion?
No, not really. Not really. I also kind of show or say in my book, I also kind of thought that he expected to be the go-to guy for anthrax and forensics after the mailings were discovered, that we would go to him because he was one of the country's experts in anthrax.
We stand for giving back to our community.
We stand for access to food for everyone who needs it.
We stand for a better future for all children.
We stand for ending hunger.
Through your support, Feeding Tampa Bay is transforming the well-being of our region today, tomorrow, and for generations to come. Stand with us.
Now is the best time to start working at Amazon. They are offering sign-on bonuses up to $3,000 and hourly pay up to $22 per hour. You'll bring home a great weekly paycheck, and many jobs come with benefits that start on your first day. That's higher pay, sign-on bonuses, benefits day one. And you'll be part of a safe and inclusive workplace ranked among the best in the world. Go to Amazon.com/apply to start your job search today. Amazon is proud to be an equal opportunity employer.
And ask him to help, and this would improve his status and, professional status where he was working. He was not even a supervisor in his job. He hadn't really progressed very rapidly in his career. So I kind of think that also played into it. And unfortunately for him, we did not use him as the go-to guy. So it just didn't work out that way.
Okay, we should take a little commercial break. We're with Scott Decker, former FBI, Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. His website is rscottdecker.com, and once again, you can catch him in Phoenix, November 1st to the 3rd at the Arizona State University for like a book conference on his book. What, are you going to be speaking down there?
No, I'm just going to be attending. They already had the panels arranged and set up when I became aware of the conference, but I do know some of the people, and I think the attendance will be about 400. So if anybody's interested in writing narrative nonfiction, what we call creative nonfiction, there'll be some very good writers there you can network with.
Okay, excellent. And also to the Bomb Museum here in Las Vegas on Black Friday, November 23rd at 4 p.m. And then you're going to be signing your book then, right?
We'll have 6 local crime authors there. I was just there yesterday. My wife gave a talk. And, on Black Friday, we're going to have, they're going to host 6 of us local authors that write in true crime. And the museum, I have no standing in it at all, but I would say if you're in Vegas, it's really a great tour. They've done a fantastic job.
Okay, great. So we'll be right back with more of Scott Decker after these messages. The Opperman Report is brought to you by SubhashTechnosis.com. Subhash Technosis is a search engine optimization and website design company. They're located in India, so you're going to save a lot of money and get top quality service. They offer all sorts of business process outsourcing, data entry, banking BPO services, recruitment process outsourcing, software testing, offshoring, research network, customer care, press release, content writing and distribution, and much, much more. Now, you can get a hold of Subhash Technosis by email at info@subhashtechnosis.com. Their website is www.subhashtechnosis.com, and their Skype is ANUSHASUBASH. Check out cartking.com, 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services, like let's say you own an office building or a warehouse. Put one of these carts there in the lobby. Well, CartKing.com can be the answer to your needs. CartKing.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail coffee and food carts and kiosks money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. From large, heated and secure outdoor retail or food kiosks to smaller, more mobile coffee kiosks or coffee stations, coffee carts, CartKing.com designs and builds them all. Carts and kiosks are fun, and so are the dozens of designs on the website, CartKing.com. Please visit today at CartKing.com or just call them at 877-986-7771. Tell them Ed Opperman sent you and you get a good deal. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You also do all the kind of different services for you. Online dating service investigations called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites. And we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites, and all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics, where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can contact me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We're here with Scott Decker, former FBI, retired. His website is rscottdecker.com. His book we're talking about today is Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax, which Amerithrax was the code name they gave for the task force name, and the evolution of forensics in the FBI. Now, Ivans, the recipients of the anthrax through the mail in Congress and in the media, it's odd that he only chose Democrats to mail to. Would you have a theory on that?
No, I'm not very well versed in politics.
Okay.
There's, from what I know of Bruce Ivans, and I talked to him several times, he was a patriot, and he had fairly conservative views. That's all I know about that. Whether it was on purpose or a coincidence, I have no idea. Hey, let me back up for a second.
Okay.
During the break, I pulled up the Vanity Fair article. It was May of 1999, Vanity Fair, and the journalist is Gary Matsumoto, Matsumoto. That was May 99, Vanity Fair. It's I believe you can pull that down off online. So,
and what about the news outlets and the media people that he mailed to? Can you describe them for us?
Tom Brokaw up in New York City received one letter. We recovered it. And the editor at NBC News, or NBC, received a second letter. Those were and then the AMI building, American Media Inc., Boca Raton, Florida. Those were the three media outlets that did receive letters. We believe AMI did also. We don't have the letter. There may have been one to ABC and possibly another one in New York, but we never recovered the letters there. I can't say for sure. And again, why his motive for those targets, I don't know. I just couldn't even speculate on that.
Now, you say you interviewed him several times. Can you describe that? Ivans.
Yeah, I would. He worked at an institution, and I know you've had this on an earlier interview. If I can get the acronym. The acronym is USAMRIID, United States Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID. And we say RID or USAMRIID in conversation. They're in Frederick, Maryland. And before 2001, when I started in the biological weapon research area in 97, when I went to Quantico, we had an MOU with USAMRIID to help us with forensics for biological weapons. But we used another individual, Dr. John Ezell was our go-to guy. And John had developed a microbial forensics laboratory that was extremely good in trace analysis of these weapons. Whatever trace of anthrax was left behind at a crime scene, John was very good. John and his technicians were very good at identifying the substance, just trace amounts. I believe the Secret Service used him also. So he was our go-to guy. So I was frequently up in USAMRIID going to see John and another researcher named Pat Warsham, who was very instrumental in helping us. And I would bump into Bruce in the hallway, and we would talk sometimes. And I realized from what he said and what I had heard about him that he was an expert in making spores, anthrax spores. Because his job was to develop a better vaccine. In order to prove the vaccine he developed was better than the old one, they would challenge animals with anthrax spores after the animals had been vaccinated with the new vaccine. That was Bruce's job, to produce those spores and to help with the research in developing a new and better anthrax vaccine. So I eventually went to him because I was trying to learn the art and science of growing anthrax and making spores and how this was done. Dried anthrax spores hadn't been made in this country since 1969, I'm going to say. That's when the U.S. government had a large biological weapon program, which President Nixon shut down in 1969. And all the dried anthrax weapons the country had was destroyed. So nobody had seen dried anthrax, at least we were unaware of it, until 2001 of September. October, really, when we recovered the letters. So anyway, long and short, I went to Bruce and his technician to ask them to explain to me the science of making anthrax spores, so we could plug that information into the investigation. If there were special items of equipment needed, we could identify who had bought that equipment. If there were special reagents needed, we would look at the supply houses and see who may have bought a lot of those reagents just before the mailings. You know, pretty standard detective work, really.
Sure.
And he and his technician was named Pat Fellows. She's since moved on to other companies. They explained to me, and it was a bit of an art. When they did it, they said sometimes it just wouldn't work, and they really weren't sure why. They knew if they kept the light off, it helped. Things like this. If they put the growing flask in tinfoil, that may help. They weren't sure what the science was behind it. They observed it did make better spores. And they did publish their work, and I asked them, when you publish your methods and materials in a paper on a new vaccine, you know, and they describe how they made the spores, because that could be important, I asked them, do they put all the techniques and nuances in their write-up in the methods and material? They said, no, we don't. We purposely leave out some of the critical details, and if somebody in the country wants to learn how to make anthrax spores, now these are wet spores, not dry, Pat Fellows would go to that person's lab and show them how to do it. But they did, in the publications that anybody in the world could get, they did leave out critical factors. So it was educational, talking to Bruce and Pat. But we did not use Bruce as a go-to person for forensics. We stayed with John Ezell for that. And the reason was not that Bruce wasn't a good scientist. It was that his lab was full of concentrated spores. That was his job, to make concentrated spores for vaccine challenge experiments. So if we're looking at a trace analysis and using a lab which has large quantities of the same concentrated stuff, it's a recipe for disaster forensically. So we just didn't use Bruce's lab because it was just the potential for contamination was too great. Whereas John Ezell was a student of trace analysis, and his lab was pristine, clean.
Now, the anthrax that was used in the mailings, where do you conclude that anthrax was developed? At Bruce Irvin's lab where he worked, or did he set up a second lab at his home or in a warehouse or something?
That was the big break in the case for us.
Okay.
That was the aha moment. The spores that were made, the spores that were dried and put in the envelopes and sent through the mail, ultimately killed 5 people. I lost my train of thought here.
Where were those spores made?
Okay, yeah. The spores in those letters matched genetically. The DNA matched perfectly to spores in a large flask, which started out as 1,000 milliliters, 1 liter, about a half a quart, I believe, of highly concentrated, pure anthrax spores. And that flask of highly concentrated spores was made and maintained and kept by Bruce Ivins in his laboratory at USAMRIC. So that was the origin of our letters. That
Gotcha.
flask under Bruce Ivins. He was the custodian of it.
But do we know where? Do we know where and how he produced the spores, the dried spores that were mailed? Was it from his lab there, where he had his big jug of stuff? You're talking about, or what? Did he have another lab set up someplace?
We never identified another lab.
Wow.
If he had one, like a garage somewhere in the neighborhood he was renting, we never found it, and that's again speculation. We could look at those. That large flask of spores was called RMR 1029. RMR was for research reference material, or research material reference. I don't know why they named it like that, but that was their naming convention. And this batch was batch 1029. They had a batch 1030 and so forth. But this one was RMR 1029. And that had been made, some of it by Bruce and Pat Fellows, had made small quantities of spores themselves and added to that flask. But the bulk of it came under contract from Dugway Proving Grounds outside Salt Lake City in Utah. They had USAMRIID and the research group, the Anthrax research group there, which Ivins was a part of, forecast that to develop the new vaccine that they were trying to do, they would require many more spores than Bruce and Pat could grow on their own, produce on their own. So they let a contract at Dugway Proving Grounds, and they took receipt of 7 large batches of spores from Dugway. Dugway has fermenters out there. It's a real production facility. USAMRIID did not have that capability. So they had it fermented out in Dugway, and it was shipped back to Bruce. When one of the 7 shipments came in, Bruce would take it and further purify it. And when he was done, RMR 1029 was very concentrated and very high degree of pureness. What's the right word? The spores were very pure in that there was very little, if any, cell debris left over. Very little agar or growth media was left behind. The spores were pure. So if anybody had dried that down, it would be a powder. It could turn into an aerosol very easily due to its pureness. We do not think he took it directly out of that flask and mailed it. And the reason I'm saying that, I know one of your interviews a couple of years ago brought this out, and it's publicly known. The spores sent to New York City and the spores sent to Capitol Hill are very different when you look at them under a microscope. So that's why we think he took the spores from his 1029 batch and grew up smaller amounts for the mailings. That's based on the fact that the New York City spores are very dirty, granular, not pure at all. The spores he sent to Capitol Hill, to Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, are very pure, highly concentrated dry spores. So it appears that he made 2 different batches at a minimum, if not 3.
Now, is it possible he could only make small batches? Is that why? Like, why wouldn't he, or could he make big batches?
His lab could only make what we call
small batches.
Small is a relative term.
Right.
Not nearly what they forecast the amount of spores that they would need in the next couple of years for their research. Bruce would have to work night and day. And a fermenter is a large stainless steel, I don't know what the word for it is. They're tall. They can be 3 feet tall. They can be 10 feet, 8 feet tall maybe. And they're circular, big sealed barrels, I guess. And they ferment the bugs under there. And the fermentation project allows the bacteria to grow to a high concentration. Whereas in Bruce's lab and all the other labs at USAMRIID, I don't believe anybody had a fermenter. I could be wrong, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. So they could only do small batches, just stirring a glass flask around in a circle to aerate it. Okay. So they just didn't have the capability there. And I don't think the command at USAMRIID wanted to invest in that type. It was cheaper and more efficient in the long run to contract it out to Dugway.
Now, in your contact with Bruce Ivins, was it always friendly? You're both working on the same team, or did you ultimately interrogate him and question him in connection with these crimes?
Initially, yeah, he was very amenable to one. In fact, he appeared like he wanted to help us. Again, we didn't want to go to his lab for work because of the high amount of spores that were there. When I interviewed him, and I try to show this in the book. I try to describe one afternoon. I talked to him and Pat, and they described how they made aerosol plumes to challenge the animals vaccinated with the new vaccines that had been inoculated with the new vaccine. And when they described what they did, they put the wet slurry up into the air as an aerosol. I naively said, well, it sounds like what you're doing is the same thing someone would do to produce a biological weapon. Send it up in the air as a mist, an aerosol. And Bruce got mad. He changed 180 degrees. His personality changed, and he was irate. And I didn't know what was coming next. He's not a big guy, but you don't have to be big to cause some damage. So I was on alert, and he shouted, "No, it isn't." Just shouted. Complete change in demeanor. So I de-escalated things and said, "Well, I apologize for my stupidity. I'm naive, etc. I didn't mean it." But that always stuck with me, and I wrote it up when I got back to the office because that was odd, I guess. Later on in the investigation, after we were pretty sure it was him, and in a criminal investigation or criminal terrorism investigation, it's always a judgment call is when you approach your subject. A subject is the Bureau's term for the person that did it, the perpetrator. And it's always a judgment because if you approach them before you have all the evidence, you're obviously going to alert them that they're under suspicion. They could destroy evidence that hadn't been found yet. They could take off. They could leave the country. They could go to a country that we don't have extradition treaty with. So it's always a judgment call. When I worked bank robberies, I don't think I interviewed a subject until I had an arrest warrant in hand. But the decision was made by the task force to interview him before we had all the evidence gathered, before we had an indictment, etc. He was interviewed one time by Rick Lambert, a very lengthy interview. And then when Ed Montooth and Vince Lizzie came on the task force and Rick transferred to Knoxville, Ed Montooth and Lizzie interviewed Bruce twice, January and then in February. And the idea was to get him on record so if we indicted and went to trial, he wouldn't be able to change his story. He would go on record as giving these answers. But that obviously put him on alert that he was under suspicion. That happened January, February, 2 different interviews. Not really confrontational, somewhat, but not very confrontational. And then in June of 2008, approximately 6 months after those 2 interviews, he was interviewed for the final time. And that one was somewhat confrontational. He was asked questions, the same things he had been asked back in January and February, and his story started to change. He was confronted with those changes. It didn't go well for him. And he committed suicide about it later.
Are these interrogations or these questionings, is there a transcript or a tape recording available for the public to go view?
Hang on, I got a call waiting in my ear here.
Okay.
Okay, they hung up. The FBI, as policy, does not record when we interview. And I've been asked that on the witness stand. The interviews are written up. They're supposed to be very detailed. We have to write them up in 5 working days. That's policy, or else we're out of policy. And I've also answered to that on the witness stand as to why I missed the deadline a couple times. But they were all written up within the 5 days. And what happened is after DOJ closed the case in 2010, the FBI released a lot of the documents and put them online. And your audience can find them online now. They are redacted. Like the ones I wrote, my name has been eked out. But a person can read them and get the gist of what was happening. And the ones with Bruce Ivins, they did not redact his name. But the people that did the interviews, those names are redacted.
So,
mine being one of them.
Ivins never left a confession or a suicide note to confess to any of this?
No, he sure didn't.
And the manner of death, the manner of the suicide was by Tylenol.
Right.
Which is, do you find that unusual?
At the time I did. While researching for the book and talking to a toxicologist, a very good toxicologist at University of Virginia, it turns out that Tylenol poisoning is fairly common as a method of poisoning here in the U.S. It's not all that uncommon. What happens is the Tylenol, and I myself have always known I'd stopped taking Tylenol years ago because, it's hard on your liver.
Yeah.
So I gave up taking the stuff. But if a person eats a lot of it, takes a lot of it, either in liquid or dry form, it will start to attack your liver as a toxin. And after your liver begins to fail, then the other organs start to fail. The domino effect, the kidney will fail, the kidneys, the heart will begin to fail, and the individual will become septic. That's when bacteria start to run rampant through the bloodstream because the immune system is breaking down also. It's also a painful way to go. The early stages of Tylenol poisoning, I'm told, are very painful. So what Bruce did, and we know two different things tell us he poisoned himself with Tylenol. And I think it was Tylenol PM, a little sedative added to it, if I remember. But we went through his trash after the suicide. There were two receipts. One receipt for 2 large bottles of Tylenol were in his trash, dated the day before he killed himself. And then toxicology screens at the hospital before he died also showed Tylenol metabolites in his system. And they concluded it was Tylenol poisoning. What he did, they also found metabolites or traces in his, I think, urine of Valium. So we believe he took the Valium together with the Tylenol. The Valium would keep him sedated in the early stages of the poisoning, so he wouldn't feel the pain. He would be asleep. And if he didn't feel the pain and he was sleeping, he would not be tempted to call for help. The Valium is metabolized quicker than the Tylenol is, I believe. The Valium started to wear off when he was in the hospital. He woke briefly, and he admitted to a nurse that he did try to commit suicide. At that point, by the time the Valium wore off, his organs were in too bad a shape to really be saved. And I guess he had a living will, and his spouse had them take him off life support once his organs failed. So, again, I describe it in my book, and I'm not a toxicologist, so if some of that is off a little bit, it's my fault.
We only have about 5 minutes left. In the description of your book, it says that there's some other little-known stories that you can share with us. Anything that we haven't heard before that you want to share with us?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Little-known stories. Well, I mean, we did some interesting things during the investigation. Ultimately, didn't prove, there was negative. Proved it go nowhere. I went to South Africa on a trip.
Happily, yeah.
And yeah, it's a long plane ride. A real long plane ride. A fascinating country. Cape Town is a beautiful place. It really is. I would think like going back in time, what California was like maybe in the 20s or 30s. A lot of stretches along the beach that are just vacant and empty. The reason I went there is I interviewed the Wouter Bassoon, who was supposedly the head of the South African biological weapon program back in the 70s. He ultimately, there was no connection to them, but we needed to rule him out. That was an interesting interview. It was long, and I worked with one of the South African detectives who had been on the other side during the apartheid era, and now everybody in the country was working as one, and it was interesting and very educational.
Where is Hatfield alive today?
Yes, I believe he is. Yeah.
Okay. And does he do interviews? Do you know anybody ever talk to him?
The last I saw, he did a magazine interview about 3 or 4 years ago.
Right, and I guess he's just sitting back spending his money, right, from suing the FBI. Let me ask you a question real quick, because Mueller and Comey were both involved in this investigation. Do you know both of them?
I know Mr. Mueller. We went to brief him on several occasions up in his office at headquarters. Never met Mr. Comey, and I don't recall him having any input in the case. If it was when I was not present. It was between the director and him, maybe. Well, I've met him after he was appointed director. He came out to Las Vegas and met everybody at the Las Vegas office. But, yeah, I know Mr. Mueller fairly well, and he's a tough taskmaster. He doesn't suffer slowness. You have to speak quickly, directly, and know your stuff. But he's also fair, and he's highly intelligent. So, and I think everybody who worked for him respected him a great deal.
Well, because we're both in the Vegas, local Vegas here. When you hear these radio hosts like Wayne Allen Root, these characters going on and on and on with these bizarre theories about I don't even know how to describe it, but like a whole cabal of FBI agents going after the president. What do you make of that?
Say it again. Going after who?
They're going after the president of the United States. That they would be setting up the president and interfering in the election. What do you make of that?
Not the FBI agents. FBI agents I worked with.
Right.
Now, I know when they hired me, when you come in as an agent, you have to do a panel interview, and 3 senior agents interview you and grade you on a lot of things. And they told me up front, it's not a political organization. We investigate whoever we do. We do not bend to political whims. That was back in the late 80s, but I don't think anything's changed. And again, I've been out for, 6 years now, 6 or 7 years.
Okay.
So I'm out of touch. But I just know that the agents I worked with would not do something like that.
Scott Decker, thank you so much. The book is Recounting the Anthrax Attacks, Terror, the Amerithrax Task Force, and the Evolution of Forensics in the FBI. You can check out his website at rscottdecker.com. If you're here in Nevada on Black Friday, November 23rd, you can see him at the Mob Museum there, 4 p.m. Otherwise, you can go down to this nonfiction conference in 2018 at Arizona State University, November 1st to the 3rd. You can check him out down there as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Decker.
Thank you, Ed.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay, well, there we had Scott Decker. Excellent stuff there. I think some new information we got there on the anthrax investigation from someone that was firsthand involved. We did some previous shows on this. You can check back. We did one with Richard Lambert. You can go back and check. I think it was a 2-hour interview we did with him. And also, we did a couple other ones, too, with authors, theories, and theorists involved in the case as well. So if you just Google Opperman Report Anthrax, they should pop up for you. Let's take a little commercial break, and we'll be right back with a little wrap-up here. Okay, we'll be right back after these messages.